Hello everybody and welcome here on TVP World. We're at the Europe Future Forum put on by Visegrad Insight, and joining me right now is Nicolas Tenzer. He's guest professor at Sciences Po, also author of Our War, Crime and Oblivion, Reframing Strategic Thinking, which is a book read worldwide. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Good morning, everyone.
Now, as chairman of the Center for Study and Research on Political Decision, how do you assess Europe's capacity to make unified political decisions in an increasingly polarized world and polarized Europe?
Well, I will say very frankly that I am rather pessimistic about that. I think there is absolutely a need, to take very bold decisions in many kind of realms. The first thing is, of course, the war in Ukraine. And obviously, Europe basically is not up to the challenge right now. Especially, just imagine that you have Trump elected in November, 20th of this year. What will Europe do just basically to save Ukraine and to make Ukraine win and to defeat Russia by its own? Not to say that Europe has not the capacity. Europe has the capacity to do so.
Do you see that Europe is simply not doing enough at the current moment to actually make a real impact or create a viable strategy for victory for Ukraine?
No, absolutely not. Europe is basically at war with Russia, basically because Russia has declared the war to Europe. But that's the reality. Just see, for instance, Russia is basically spending 8% or even more of its GDP to the war, in Ukraine. If you consider what Europe is spending just to defend Ukraine, and at the end of the day, to defend itself, it's less than 0.2% of the GDP. You had some countries, including yours, Poland, who has decided basically to jump, and it's a very good thing, the defense spending to 4% of the GDP. But what about Germany? What about France? What about Italy? What about Spain? Basically, we are not serious. Russia has turned its economy into a war economy. What the war economy among us? We are not even able or willing basically to sanction, fully Russia, to just prevent, of course, some other countries to circumvent the sanctions. We don't have in Europe, as we have in the US, a kind of tool which is secondary sanctions, and even Europe is still purchasing a lot of gas to Russia, because 18% of, what Europe is consuming in terms of gas is coming still from Russia. That's a pure madness. So when we talk about the unity of Europe, about the strength of Europe, sorry, that's just a mockery.
So, this is obviously a common area where we have common interests, and it is security. You mentioned Donald Trump. Donald Trump, when he was president last time, was pushing European countries to spend the minimum 2% of GDP on defense. Germany, it looks like this year, is going to include road construction works in this number to reach 2%. So the question is, we have seen a big uptick in spending in Europe. Do you think that's a result of the fear of Donald Trump coming back in the elections coming up in November, or is this a direct response to the war in Ukraine?
Basically that's both, but if we take up this challenge seriously, both challenges, return of Trump and the war in Ukraine, the effort made by Europe, is not up to the task. Let's speak bluntly. We have to say the truth.
Okay,
and we
so
have to say the truth
this?
Also to the public opinion. Just take an example. Let's imagine that Russia is attacking, let's say, Estonia, for instance. What we should do, especially because it's not a question of nuclear deterrence, that's a question of conventional deterrence. Will, most of the EU countries, I'm not talking about Poland only, not only because Poland cannot do everything itself by itself, but also France, but also outside the EU, the UK, not to mention the US that will probably abstain, but also Germany, Italy, Spain, etc. Will they send troops to Estonia?
Would they? Do you think they would activate Article 5?
Fighting troops. not protecting troops as we have right now. And about NATO, because I think NATO basically, that's a European alliance, you see that the indecisiveness of NATO in basically retaliating to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And I think in terms of deterrence, the fact that NATO is not taking action in Ukraine could be a very bad omen if one of the EU countries is attacked. And I think the very question, but that's a strategic thinking I have no time to elaborate on right now, that's part of my book, etc., which is basically if NATO is not willing to take action in Ukraine, it's even more risky to take action if, let's say, Estonia is attacked. Will it do so or not? And I think the real question of deterrence should be really questioned right now.
It seems like the general thinking in Europe is that Russia won't attack a NATO country, and if it did, then Article 5 would be enacted of the NATO treaty. Do you believe that that all of our European NATO members, or even including the United States, would enact Article 5 if there was an attack on a small country like Estonia?
I hope so, but I'm not certain. And that's a real question of the credibility of NATO, because of the US. As we perfectly know, the US is the main solution, but it's also the main problem. Not only with Mr. Trump is elected, there's also a question if Mrs. Harris is elected. If Mrs. Harris is elected, and let's say Estonia is attacked, etc. I mean, what will the US do? I mean, that's a real question, and I think we have also basically to not to think about the questions of, let's say, the difference of NATO and not NATO countries. Because when Ukraine was attacked, I mean, basically in 2014, I was one of the rare voices in France and probably in Europe to say, well, we have to take action. We have to take action right now. You remember, all the attacks, on European soil. Of Russia, not only, I mean, the poisoning of dissidents. You had, of course, Litvinenko. In 2006, you had, Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. You had also, the explosion of the ammunition depot in Reptice in Czech Republic. You had also the attack in Bulgaria. You have probably, also the arsons, committed, in Poland. You had, I mean, this guy who had preparing a terrorist attack, in Grassy in France, etc. You had the assassination, of opponents of Kadyrov. Basically, Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation, as we know. I mean, also in Germany, etc. What were the reaction of the NATO allies? I mean, and I can, of course, give you a lot of examples about that. So basically, Russia is testing our resolve, and the fact is that basically, if we consider all the crimes committed by Mr. Putin since 24 years, I mean, basically, Mr. Putin was right to say, well, okay, I can continue. Let's go, I continue. Well, what was the response? What was the response? And I am sure, just I made, in my book also the counterfactual, I mean, historical scenario. Let's imagine that it was not the resistance of the Ukrainian people after February 24, 2022. Just imagine that Mr. Zelensky had accepted to take a taxi. And what will have been the reaction of the EU countries or the US or NATO countries in general? They will say, okay, no, we will blame Russia. We have, of course, no wrong on sanction, but after 1 year or 2 years, that will have been business as usual with Russia. Let's be very clear on that.
In your opinion, what role should NATO take right now in Ukraine?
I think first of all, that was something that I was advocating since I mean day one, which is basically we should have taken direct action.
A direct confrontation.
Direct confrontation, and I remember there was on February 24th, I had 11 TV shows in Paris, France. About the war. And I remember my point was, no, we have to take action. It is basically, you had Russian troops in Ukraine. It's perfectly legitimate and legal, basically, to strike the Russian troops in Ukraine. That's basically the Article 51 of the UN Charter. And we have to comply with this article. We have to enforce this article. And you remember the reaction during the first months, or let's say before Bucha, and before particularly the Allies show, I mean the resistance of the Ukrainian people, the resolve of President Zelensky, and his cabinet. And before, remember Germany was sending helmets. And even you had also already these reactions of the people. Well, basically, we must not, basically provoke Russia. We must not escalate. You still have this speech, you know, if you consider what Mr. Sullivan or and Joseph Feiner, his deputy are saying, basically, well, escalation. There is a true risk of nuclear war with Russia, a war between Russia and NATO, etc. All those narratives that are coming directly from the Kremlin's playbook. We have to understand that, because I studied, what the Kremlin is saying since very long. And you have, the leaders of 3 countries basically pasting this kind of narratives. So basically what we have to do now, if we don't accept direct intervention, I think we should. And I was very happy, from the U-turn from my president, Emmanuel Macron, because you remember he was saying at the beginning of the war, we have to offer, security guarantees to Russia, etc., etc. And now he was envisioning, that was the speech on February 26th of this year, basically saying we must not rule out the possibility to send troops. So let's do it. If we don't accept this, I think first of all we have to lift all the restrictions on the use of weapons given by the allies to Ukraine. Long-range missiles, and we have to provide more long-range missiles, absolutely needed. We have to strike in depth, Russian territory, because we have to defeat Russia. And the real issue is, if you were talking at the beginning of the interview about, the question of the unity of Europe. There is no unity in Europe, or within the allies in general, considering the US, about, the war aim, our own war aim. And our own war aim must be to defeat Russia. We have, first of all, to defeat Russia in Ukraine. But let's be very clear. We have to finish the job. And we'll have to defeat Russia also in Georgia, also in Belarus, also in Syria, also, in African countries, and we know that, you have the Russian mercenaries or even army having, the footprints, in many African countries. Also, let's say in Myanmar, you consider Cuba, you consider Venezuela, you consider Nicaragua. And I think we have to finish the job. And I think we have to think about that strategically, but the real issue is that in most of the European capitals, I'm not talking about Warsaw, nor Tallinn, nor Vilnius, but most of the Western capitals on the US, you don't have the strategic vision. And which is very important is to define that, and you have to have this scenario, and to stop buying also Putin's nuclear threats.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like there's no political appetite indeed across the wider Europe, maybe even the United States. Nicolas Tenzer, thank you very much for joining us today. We really much appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.